In the United States, anarchism emerged as a large-scale social, political, revolutionary movement really only in the 1880s. And it was from that time until really after the Second World War, anarchism in the United States was a movement composed of first and second generation immigrants, mostly from Europe. But most of those immigrants did not become anarchists until after they arrived. For instance, Germany and the Russian Empire had virtually no real anarchist movements to speak of in this era. There were no anarchist groups in Russia until 1903, but the first Russian Jewish anarchist group in New York City was formed in 1887. In Italy, the story is a bit different. You had a large-scale anarchist movement in the 1870s that then declined, and then after that decline, you have an Italian immigrant movement that springs up in the United States. So it's a movement of immigrants initially in the 1880s. This is a movement mostly of German and Czech immigrants who are heavily involved in the labor movement. A lot of them formerly had been socialists, became disillusioned in parliamentary politics, and moved to anarchism in the US. As migration changed, as fewer Germans came, more immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe came, they displaced that sort of first wave of anarchists. The two largest groups were Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe and Italians. They formed newspapers with circulations that sometimes reached into the tens of thousands. They formed mutual aid societies, reading groups, radical libraries, radical schools. They spearheaded labor movements and labor agitation wherever they happened to be in whatever occupation. They helped, Jewish anarchists helped form some of the first garment workers' unions for Jewish workers. Italians helped form some of the first organizations for Italians, whether they were silk workers in Paterson, New Jersey, or unskilled Italians working in California. And they really created not only these more institutional things that I'm talking about, but they created communities and countercultures. They created a whole world where you could be born to anarchist parents, delivered by an anarchist midwife. Emma Goldman worked as a midwife for a while, for instance, one of the more prominent American anarchists. You could attend an anarchist school. When you grew up, you would work somewhere alongside anarchist comrades, belong to the anarchist union. On weekends, you'd go to an anarchist ball, anarchist speeches, anarchist picnics, which were ubiquitous throughout the era. And then when you died, you had an anarchist funeral. It was a whole little microcosm where these individuals, at least to the degree that they could, given the constraints of the society in which they lived, carve out a real anarchist lifestyle for themselves. While at the same time, not being content simply to live anarchism as much as they could, but to spread those ideas and to try to take on, directly at times, capitalism and the state, which is no mean feat to attempt, especially when you're a working class immigrant of small means. And it's really remarkable how they were able to perpetuate these cultures. You had Italian and Yiddish language anarchist newspapers in the United States that continued publication until the 1970s, till really the last surviving members of that generation were dying out. They tried to pass on these ideas to their children, to second generation immigrants, with mixed success. To the extent that anarchism and anarchist groups continued to exist and struggle along through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, it was largely made up of the second generation. To that minority of the second generation who carried on the ideals of their parents. And then in the 1960s, with the emergence of the New Left in the United States and elsewhere, sort of a whole new segment of society, these radicalized students, were able to tap into what survived of the previous movement, draw on some of those ideas, interact with some of those people, and help rebuild an anarchist wing to that new left, which then served as a springboard subsequently for anarchism in the 70s and 80s through punk rock and other countercultures, which got a boost with the anti-globalization movement of the late 90s and 2000s, to really give birth to a new sort of generation, a new kind of anarchism, which still has direct links all the way back to those movements from the late 19th century. But which, again, it's no longer a movement of immigrants. It's no longer based as strongly in working class politics, but that's really where its roots lie, if you trace it back.